to follow two courses. I had one course reduction in the fall, but back to...
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is James Person, and I run the North Korea International Documentation Project, which is part of the History and Public Policy program here at the center, alongside its the Cold War International History Project. The NKIDP, as we call it, serves as an informational clearinghouse on North Korea for both the scholarly and policymaking communities by widely disseminating newly declassified documents on the DPRK from the archives of its former communist allies that provide valuable insight into the actions and nature of the North Korean state. The Wilson Center was established by an act of Congress 40 years ago as our nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. As both a distinguished scholar and a national leader, Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and the policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise. The Wilson Center is a nonpartisan institute for advanced study and a neutral forum for open, serious, and informed dialogue. We're honored to have such a distinguished panel today. We have J.J. Sa, Greg Brzezinski, and Catherine Moon to talk about J.J.'s new book, Power, Interest, and Identity in Military Alliances, a study of the U.S.-ROK alliance that explores how the durability and success of military alliances hinges upon a combination of balance of power and alliance politics, cultural, national, and institutional identities, and shared perceptions about adversaries. The author, J.J. Sa, is an associate professor and director of Korean Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Catherine Moon is the Jane Bishop Professor of Political Science at Wellesley College and author of Sex Among Allies, Military Prostitution in U.S.-Korea Relations. Greg Brzezinski is an assistant professor of history and international affairs at the George Washington University and author of Nation Building in South Korea, Koreans, Americans, and the Making of a Democracy. So we'll start with JJ, who will talk for between 25 and 30 minutes, and then move on to commentary with Catherine and Greg talking for approximately 15 minutes each. We'll then open the floor for questions. Now, we are being webcast live, so I'll ask that you wait until you receive a microphone before asking a question so that people watching us will be able to hear your questions. JJ, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, James, for your kind introduction. And first of all, I'd like to thank the North Korean Documentation Project and the Wilson Center for sponsoring this event. I never thought I would get my book out, and I never thought I would have an opportunity to promote my book. And so I'm especially grateful for this opportunity. And I also like to thank Professors Catherine Moon and Greg Brzezinski for taking on the cumbersome task of being a discussant. I know how time-consuming and difficult it can be, but they graciously agreed to come down, especially Catherine Moon came down all the way from Boston for today's event. So my thanks go out to them. And last but not least, I'd like to thank you all for coming to what could be a boring book event on this such a glorious day. We could spend a great day outside, but you all chose to come in. And hopefully my event, my talk, and commentators' remarks, as well as your interventions would be stimulating enough to compensate for that. All right, my topic is U.S.-Korea alliance, and more specifically, why the U.S. alliance has persisted until today, and perhaps into the near future. Let me quickly jump over to the puzzle. Just 2 years ago, in 2006, there were a lot of questions and indeed doubts about the viability of the U.S.-Korea alliance. And Kurt Campbell famously stated that South Korea-U.S. relationship resembles that of a king and a queen who go their separate ways while maintaining their marital status. So there were many concerns that the U.S. and South Korea were on separate ways. And they were not just declaring the end of the marriage because there are a lot of costs involved, but politically and otherwise, the alliance seemed destined for a divorce. And it was not just pure political conjecture. That kind of a concern had a lot of bases. One of which was a growing anti-U.S. sentiments in South Korea. And 2002 was a major turning point in the ways in which South Koreans perceived South Korea. And toward the end of that year, there was a huge candlelight vigils and demonstrations against what they perceived was an unjust U.S. troop presence in South Korea. Following that kind of a surge of anti-U.S. demonstrations, Roh Moo-hyun was elected president of South Korea. And he's the guy who took pride in the fact that he never traveled outside, just like someone in this country. And he was seen as the president who could say no. He was a fierce human rights lawyer who had a progressive politics and who had somewhat independent view of the U.S. and perhaps a critical perspective of the U.S. South Korea alliance. And so his election, combined with the rise of anti-U.S. sentiments in South Korean society, was seen as the beginning of the end of the U.S.-Korea alliance. And it was not just this kind of a political phenomenon, but also there were changes on the fundamental level that created problems for the alliance in the 1990s. Throughout the 70s and 80s, South Korea's power continued to rise economically and militarily, whereas North Korean power declined. And it's perhaps fair that the level of North Korean threat remained more or less the same. And reflecting the shifting balance of power, the alliance itself was also adjusting. And by 1990, the U.S. and South Korea made an agreement to reduce the U.S. troop presence, and they even made an agreement to study the possibility of disbanding the U.S. forces command in South Korea. Now, if that was what had happened up until 1990, things looked even worse for the alliance in the 1990s because South Korean power continued to rise. And this is the decade when South Korean economy really shot off. And in parallel with South Korea's economic growth, South Korea's military power also grew rather at a rapid pace. And this is the period when North Korean economy had serious trouble. This is the time when North Korea could not feed its population. There was a massive starvation and a lot of death of hunger. And as a result, North Korea's military capability also began to decline. And this is also a period when South Korea and North Korea began to have a lot of exchanges, economically, socially, and otherwise. And so if up until 1990, the alliance declined, reflecting this kind of changes in power and threat, one would expect the alliance would decline even further in the 1990s because the power disparity was growing and North Korea's threat was declining. But what happened was the opposite of the expectation, because the alliance got strengthened. And this is the time when the president of South Korea was Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, who would be expected to least likely of all the South Korean presidents to strengthen the U.S. alliance. And so this is the puzzle. The alliance got strengthened exactly when many would expect it to get weakened further. And so my book is an effort to find an explanation as to why that happened. And here I make a two-step argument. Initially, the power distribution leads to the creation of the alliance, and the Korean War and the aftermath was the major turning point in the U.S.-Korea relations, and reflecting the profound power imbalance between the North and the South. The U.S. and South Korea created the alliance. But once the alliance was created, it began to produce its effects in terms of generating interest in the alliance, in maintaining the alliance. And also, it began to produce identity effects, cultural, social, and political effects that constitute the identity of the allies and the enemies. At time T2, the products of the alliance, namely interest and identity, take on a life of their own and become an independent factors. And interest begins to affect the alliance operation. And identity itself becomes an independent factor that affects the alliance. And so the combination of the forces generated by interest and identity produces the force that sustains the alliance, regardless of what happens in the power distribution. Now, having given you a broad outline of the puzzle and the argument, let me elaborate a little bit. What do I mean by interest? Alliance creates what I call asset specificity. And this is the concept that I borrow from Oliver Williamson, who developed the institutional economics. And the core argument that he makes in the body of literature he develops is that economic transactions tend to lead to the creation of asset specificity. Asset specificity is the assets, durable investments that are made in support of the particular transactions, and these are durable investments that are specific to the alliance and that are less useful for other kinds of transactions. And just as economic transactions lead to asset specificity, security transactions also lead to asset specificity. And these asset specificity can be categorized into 4 types: equipment specificity, process specificity, human asset specificity, and process location specificity. Equipment specificity is created mainly because there is an interoperability requirement of the alliance. And the allied militaries have to be able to operate together, and maintaining interoperability of weapon systems and the militaries is a critical component of the military alliance. And that requirement leads to equipment specificity in terms of the kinds of weapons produced and purchased, and the kind of infrastructure that's constructed in support of military operations. So, for example, Korean military and the U.S. military operate tanks, and one is a Korean tank and the other is the U.S. tank. And from the picture, it's hard to tell which is which, and I always have to look carefully to see which is which. And on this is a Korean K1A1 tank, and this is M1A1 tank. This is the American version, and this is a Korean version. And as you can see, the two tanks share a lot of similar characteristics. And this kind of similar weapon systems are not just limited to tanks, but also include most weapon systems that the two militaries operate and use. And that kind of equipment specificity is also reflected in weapons imports. If you look at the numbers of weapons imports from the U.S. and the rest of the world, the U.S. imports occupy 70 to 65% of all weapons imports by South Korea. And this reflects the kind of weapons interoperability requirement that's put on the alliance. And of course, Korea produces a lot of weapon systems, and K1A1 tank is just one of the examples. And the table shows some samples of the weapon systems that Korea produces. But the weapons Korea produces also have a U.S. design, so that those weapons maintain interoperability with the weapon systems that the U.S. military operates. And so, as you can see, most of the weapons that Korea produces are U.S. design, and there are some very small number of Korean weapons that are non-U.S. design. And alliance also puts a pressure to create process specificity. This is operating procedures and strategies and warfighting plans. This is a software that's created by the alliance, and because the allied militaries have to be prepared to fight all kinds of contingencies. They come up with all kinds of plans and the contingency plans and operation plans. And those plans are specific to the alliance. And these represent durable investments that the allied militaries and governments make in support of the alliance operations. And these are durable investments that are specific to the alliance and less useful for other types of military arrangements. And process specificity also refers to the organizational structure that the alliance creates in support of, again, the allied operations. Alliance also creates a human asset specificity in terms of the kind of human interactions and a specific human capacity that are created in support of the allied operations. And so they get to know each other, and one of the obvious aspects of a human asset specificity is the language. And allied countries and the militaries have to have a common language that they can use for operations and exercises. And Korean military puts a heavy emphasis on the acquisition of English. And so many officers are capable of speaking English. And there is a special contingent of Korean forces that serves as an interface between the U.S. military and South Korean military. And this is a kind of a durable investment again that's created in support of the alliance, and that's specific to the alliance and less useful for other types of security arrangement. And finally, alliance also leads to location specificity in terms of bases, infrastructures, and other things that require heavy investment in support of the alliance. So alliance, once it's created, generates the pressure on the allies to make a durable investment, make a set of durable investments that are specific to the alliance. And these take the form of those 4 types of specificities that I laid out. Alliance also produce some effects on the ways in which allied members perceive their identities and enemies' identities. And there are 3 ways in which alliance affects identity perception. And one is discursive practices. And so the allied militaries, intelligence, and governments produce intelligence estimates, threat assessment, and other document statements and representations that constitute the enemy identity as the enemy, and allies' identity as a countries that provide for security. So, for example, North Korea can take on any of these identities that I laid out on this. So, North Korea can be the dangerous other, or North Korea can be a defender of Koreanness, as North Korean official rhetorics would have it. And North Korea could also take on the identity of a rational bargaining state, as many would argue. Of these possible identities, the alliance discourses and practices privilege, number 1, North Korea's identity as a dangerous other. Alliance also affects identity perception by its behavior. So, for example, it's engaged in military exercises, military aid, as well as economic assistance. And these acts themselves have the effect of producing the image of the allies as someone who's providing public goods for the allies. The alliance also creates institutions that stabilize identity perceptions. And so defense treaty is the highest level of institution that ties the 2 countries together in an alliance, and that specifies the enemy. And the allied countries have a number of domestic laws and regulations that embody identity perceptions. So, for example, South Korea has national security law that literally identifies North Korea as anti-state entity. And the U.S. has a Trading with the Enemy Act and a list of terrorism sponsoring states that literally identify North Korea as enemy or terrorism sponsoring states. So the combination of all these things that the alliance does have the effect of producing the identity of the allies and the identity of the enemy. Now, if these things go on for long enough, the specificities and identities take on a life of their own and become independent factors and begin to affect the alliance itself. And that's what happens in the 1990s. Okay. And this is the original insight that Oliver Williamson had when he came up with the concept of asset specificity. Economic transactions lead to asset specificity, but in time, asset specificity creates governance structure. And he came up with the concept of asset specificity to explain the presence of firms. And I argue the same kind of logic is applicable to the military alliance. And so once asset specificity is created, it creates the necessity and pressure to maintain the alliance. And it does so in three major ways. One, it increases the efficiency of alliance operation. All kinds of asset specificities that have been created help ease the military operations of the allied militaries. Otherwise, you would not even invest all those resources in the first place. Secondly, it creates cost barrier to alternative arrangements. Now you have such a big sinking cost in the existing alliance. It becomes more and more difficult to think about alternatives and turn to alternatives. And finally, the specificity creates alliance constituency. This is a group of officers, officials, and civilians who have a lot of interest in maintaining the alliance. And of course, officers who work in the military, and particularly for the Combined Forces Command and the kind of the offices that deal with the U.S.-Korea relations would be part of the alliance constituency. And then there's a group of military contractors who benefit from equipment specificity because they are the ones who produce weapon systems for the alliance, and therefore they are the ones who would want to see the alliance to go on. And then there's a group of civilian networks that are created by the alliance that, in a way, have an interest in seeing the alliance to go on. And second division, which is the main ground force of U.S. forces in Korea, for example, has second division association. It's the member soldiers who were stationed in second division joined this association. And the Korean War Veterans Association, chosen few. These are the soldiers who survived the battle in the chosen battle, and others. And this kind of networks, and as well as other civilian networks that are created thanks to the alliance, also serve as an alliance constituency. So the three mechanisms by which interest support the alliance are further strengthened by identity. And identity has two dimensions. One is the perception of a threat, and the other one is a perception of the ally. And as far as the perception of a threat is concerned, I think this picture sums it up. The identity of North Korea has been entrenched as the evil, so strong. Popular movies have been created that make use of that perception, and there is even a cartoon, Team America, and here again the main antagonist is none other than Kim Jong-il. And these kind of movies can be produced because there is an entrenched image of North Korea as a threat and as the enemy. And that's not just a U.S. Popular culture, but that has a direct impact on the alliance operation. As you can see here, North Korea was designated as a 주적, the main enemy, under the Kim Young-sam administration. And then there was a little debate under the Kim Dae-jung administration whether or not to remove that expression now that South Korea was engaged in all kinds of exchanges under that administration. But in the end, the designation 주적 remained during the Kim Dae-jung administration. And with Roh Moo-hyun as the president, one would think that the debate about 주적 would intensify, and perhaps Roh Moo-hyun administration takes the step to remove it. But quite to the contrary, Korean Ministry of National Defense in 2003 designated North Korea as, quote, the most significant enemy that constantly threatens our survival and well-being. So, in a way, it's even stronger than the designation 주적. So, even if there was a lot of change in the ways in which South Korea and North Korea have interacted during the Kim Dae-jung administration and Roh Moo-hyun administration, the entrenched image of North Korea remains strong, and it becomes more and more difficult to move beyond that kind of social identity. And because there is such a strong entrenched identity, it produces all kinds of effects, political effects. And so, for example, if North Korea proposes a non-aggression pact, as it did in the early 1990s, that proposal is seen as a deception, a deceptive move, because North Korea is, of course, a threat that tries to do everything to undermine U.S.-Korea alliance. And when North Korea proposed a peace treaty, that was seen as a move to drive a wedge between the U.S. and South Korea. And when North Korea proposes arms reduction, and that was seen as a scheme to weaken the alliance. And when there was an underground facility spotted by the U.S. intelligence, that was seen as a nuclear weapons complex. And this kind of a perception of North Korean behavior is made possible by the identity of North Korea that the U.S. and South Korea have. And this can be also seen in the ways in which the U.S. intelligence dealt with a piece of inconsistency that existed between North Korea's report and IEA finding. Back in 1993, North Korea reported, back in 1992, North Korea reported to the IAEA that it had extracted about 100 grams of plutonium. And then it opened up its nuclear facilities to inspections. But when IAEA inspectors went in and checked out North Korea's facilities, they found out that North Koreans actually had extracted more than 100 grams of plutonium. And North Koreans had declared that they extracted plutonium only once. But the inspectors found that North Korea extracted plutonium more than once. So now the question was how much North Korea would have extracted and how many times North Koreans have reprocessed the spent fuel. And from 100 gram, and once CIA jumped to the conclusion that the North Korea might have one or possibly two weapons. And this is a kind of a conclusion that was made again possible by the kind of perception that the U.S. CIA had of North Korea's identity. Because North Korea is a threat that could not be trusted, worst case scenario is the way to go. It's better to err on the safe side. Of course, we can compare this with what had happened with Japan, and Japan had reprocessed its spent fuel, and there is a much bigger discrepancy between its declared amount and the actual amount. But that discrepancy in Japan did not cause this kind of a concern, whereas a much smaller discrepancy leads to the conclusion that North Korea has produced one or possibly two weapons, precisely because of the different ways in which the intelligence perceives these two countries' identities. And that can also be seen in this kind of remarks. North Korea remains indisputable. It remains indisputable that North Korea represents a major threat. And this statement came from none other than Cartman, who was a leading KIDO, Korea Peninsula Energy Development Organization, that was building the heavy fuel reactor. And this statement came from none other than Im Dong-won, who was the National Security Advisor to Kim Dae-jung, and who was known as 햇볕 정책 전도사, the mission, what's the word? Missionary for the Sunshine Policy. And so North Korea's identity as a threat, as the other, has been so strongly entrenched. Even people like Cartman and Im Dong-won repeat this kind of a same kind of threat perception of North Korea. And if that's the part of perception of the threat, there is the other side of the story, and that has to do with the ways in which South Korea perceives of American identity. And I had a problem with this. So let me just quickly move over. It began a long time ago, and this is the Sungnaemun that got burned down last month, sadly. But this is the Sungnaemun, a picture of a Sungnaemun in 1950. And note that this was even before the Korean War, and that this was even before the Mutual Defense Treaty was signed. But when the U.S. naval ship came, the big sign, welcome sign, was hung up in Sungnaemun. And President Lee Seung-man made these very glowing remark about the U.S. America has never been an invader. Americans want to assist all countries in need, desiring no compensation or land in return. The U.S., with selfless friendship, is promoting a unity of its allies to help our economy. And that kind of perception of the U.S. as a good ally is again repeated by President Park Chung-hee, and repeated by all the other presidents. And so Roh Moo-hyun and Kim Dae-jung were perhaps a major shock to the alliance, in that they did not make this kind of a glowing remark about the U.S., but nonetheless the previous presidents have made these kind of remarks and have produced image of the U.S. as a good ally, and that image has been again so strongly entrenched in the U.S. and in South Korea. And so by the 1990s, that kind of image of the good alliance is producing its effect. And so this is a time when the alliance was beginning to get weakened. And in 1992, Security Consultative Meeting suggested that it was necessary to assess whether and how the U.S. and the ROK can maintain and invigorate their security relationship should North Korea no longer pose a threat to peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. So the logic of alliance is turned on its head. The alliance is usually created because there is a threat, because the two countries need to come together to deter or defend against that threat. But now the two countries are coming together to think about the ways in which to invigorate the alliance, just in case the threat disappears. And the SCM directed RAND and Kaida Korea Institute of Defense Analysis to conduct a study of ways to maintain and invigorate the alliance. And the study by these two think tanks recognized as the major challenge developing and articulating a logic for future security collaboration, assuming diminution of North Korean threat and the ultimate unification of the Korean Peninsula. So again, the logic of the alliance is turned on its head. So even if the threat goes away, alliance is a good that needs to be maintained, and therefore we need to find a way and articulate reasons for maintaining that alliance. And this kind of a reversal of the usual alliance logic was made possible because there was a strong belief in the goodness of the U.S. and goodness of the U.S.-Korea alliance. And that's why, and that's how the changes in the early 1990s that would have weakened the alliance were stopped by the late 1990s. So by early 1990s, U.S. forces Korea was being reduced, and there was a three-stage reduction plan, the first of which was implemented. And DOD was even contemplating dissolving the Combined Forces Command. But by the late 1990s, there was going to be no more reduction, and there was an agreement to further strengthen the U.S.-Korea alliance. And there was an agreement that the alliance will serve to maintain peace and stability in Northeast Asia and the Asia-Pacific region. And so here we are beginning to see a shift of the mission of the alliance. The alliance was originally created to provide for security for South Korea and the U.S., and the main threat was North Korea. But now, because the allies agreed to find a way to maintain the alliance, even after the North Korean threat disappears, they came up with a rationale that the alliance will be needed for the peace and stability of the region. And that became even more ambitious under none other than the Roh Moo-hyun administration. In the 38th SCM in 2006, the two defense ministers agreed that the ROK and the U.S. reached agreement on the joint study on the vision of the ROK-U.S. alliance, and the study determined that the future alliance would contribute to peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, in the region, and globally. And so now the alliance is needed for the peace and stability of the whole world. And that's how alliance could survive all the political problems in the 1990s and first several years of the 21st century, and all the changes in power and threat on the Korean Peninsula. And to sum up, the alliance was originally created in response to a power imbalance on the Korean Peninsula. But that in time created asset specificity, all kinds of asset specificity and identity perceptions of North Korea and the U.S. And in time, interest and identity become independent factors on their own, and they began to produce an effect on strengthening the alliance. And as a result, the alliance itself became transformed into something that would be needed to be maintained even if North Korean threat disappears. And the alliance is now reconstituted as a security arrangement, not just for the Korean Peninsula, but also for the region and the world. And this argument is based on my theoretical understanding of how power, interest, and identity interact with each other. And this is something that I call analytical eclecticism, but this perhaps interests you a little less. So I'll stop here and turn to my colleagues for their comments. Thank you.
Thank you, JJ. Catherine, would you?
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here sitting next to JJ and Greg, together with James here. I was here as a fellow several years ago, and then also split my time with GWU, Seeger Center, where Greg that's his home base. So I feel like I've got two bookends in a sense of two different but compatible identities of my time in Washington in recent years. I am so happy to have been asked to comment on JJ's book. I respect him immensely, and I think, JJ, you are you are most definitely one of the kindest, most decent, good people I know in political science. Those of you who are in political science, it's a pretty nasty field, and so it's very nice to be with somebody and to learn of his work, who is not of that genre, a different identity, I would say. There's so much in the book, and so it's impossible for any of us here to really go into it in depth. I think the strength of the book, the major strength of JJ's book, lies in the fact that he synthesizes and integrates three very disparate and often contentious schools of thought in the academic world of international relations theory: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. The three generally don't like to talk together in terms of people's work or worldviews. It's truly about identities within the academic circle. And realists in particular don't like to speak with constructivists, and realists have learned to speak a little bit better with liberals. But again, the strength of the book lies in the ability to bring all of these three major schools of thought into one piece of work with Korea, U.S., and the alliance as a case study. So that is a major contribution. I think for a lot of people who aren't used to thinking that way, it may not seem as obvious, but for those of us who deal with the theoretical work, it is something very new. And it's very hard to do, actually, and JJ has done it very well. I also think that I appreciated reading his book because, some of the strands of the arguments J.J. makes, others have tried to make within the realist school of thought or the constructivist school of thought. And so you get snippets of these ideas. For example, people have always bandied about the notion that the military and various wings and branches and offices in the military or any bureaucracy pursues interests based on organizational need, identity, culture. And so that the notion of the national interest is something we need to put a question mark at the end. That there may not be something so monolithic as a national interest because there are numerous interests in the sub-state level that eventually get contested and fought and then ironed out over time in order to come up with this thing, this abstract thing called the national interest. So people have pursued that line of study. People have also talked about the important strategic role of Korea, not so much in geopolitical terms for the United States, but the strategic role in organizational interest terms for members of the U.S. military who find the training grounds to be outstanding because it's basically still a war zone, and the training experience for the soldiers to be unique, and therefore it's another type of asset specificity. It's a very important asset. We've also heard, both anecdotally and in some cases people coming out in, op-eds or newspapers that Korea represents a plum post for members of the military who want to promote their own careers, either within the ranks of the military or in government. So these kinds of notions about the importance of South Korea as a venue or a locus of alliance relationships or alliance politics, especially as they relate to organizational and personal interests, they have been discussed. But again, they've always been discussed in more isolated or discrete, D-I-S-C-R-E-T-E, separated zones of analysis and not brought together the way J.J.'s done. So I think, again, he moves us further. I have several comments. My job, I figured you didn't pay for me to come all the way here just to obediently bow my head and say how wonderful the book is, and it is. It is quite a hefty piece of research, something that I admire greatly. But I figured you want me to offer some critical comments, so I'll do so. And this is what we do as bread and butter in our own world of academia. In reading J.J.'s book, I was left with some questions. One is, can we get a larger picture of how alliance maintenance, institutional persistence might work? That is, to put the bilateral relationship in the context of other alliance relationships that the United States in particular has, particularly the U.S.-Japan alliance. Is it possible for the U.S. to think about the alliance with South Korea completely separately from its alliance with Japan? If it is, that's a curious thing. If it's not, then we need to know what kind of constraints, opportunities flow from one to the other. Also, in terms of the specific issue of asset specificity and alliance maintenance, I would be very curious. I think you need to write another book, a sequel already. I would be very curious to know where the U.S.-Korea alliance stands in terms of asset specificity and mutual reliance, etc., compared to the U.S.-Japan relationship or U.S.-NATO at perhaps a different time, maybe during the heat of the Cold War or so. How much interoperability, how much reliance on intercommunications, how much of the mutuality was functionally built into each of these alliances, and is it possible then to get a sense of how deep or intense the U.S.-Korea alliance was? Because if the U.S.-Korea alliance has even a more intense asset specificity relationship than the others, then that would push your argument even further, that there's something really unique in this alliance that has a certain logic of its own apart from all the geopolitical and other interests. Another question, this is now looking at internal Korean politics. So rather than the regional or external larger alliance situation, looking at the let me stay with the external situation for a minute. That, again, perhaps a sequel is needed, because I'm wondering, is the 1990s, are the 1990s, that decade, too short a time for us to assess the impact of changes around the world and impact of changes within Korea? And let me be specific here. That perhaps the transition time might be too short to understand the impact of geopolitical changes in the region and around the world following the Cold War, or the end of the Cold War, on the U.S.-ROK alliance, right? We're looking at these issues almost happening simultaneously, and lots of question marks in so many people's minds, so many government and civilians' minds about how the world is transforming. So do we need to factor in a certain kind of lag time or a catch-up time for elites as well as society to understand the larger impact of geopolitical changes and how these things might affect specific institutions like an alliance for the long haul? Related is the fact that South Korea was going through the unbelievably creative, dynamic, and tumultuous throes of democratization and democratic consolidation during the 1990s. And people were just beginning to figure out how to do democracy, and Koreans are still trying to figure it out in one of the most robust ways on earth. And in the early 1990s in particular, I'm wondering, was it too short a time to expect the military in particular and the various security agencies in particular to learn its new place in society so that its hegemonic status might need time to transform? Because we certainly began to see those transformations by the late 1990s and definitely into the early 2000s. Similarly, on the societal side, civil society as well as bureaucratic interests in government only began to take shape in independent ways throughout the 1990s, really from the mid-1990s on. So again, perhaps we might need to give them more time to consolidate, to shore up their own identities and interests, to challenge the hegemonic discourses and conventions that had been in place for practically 50 or so years. So I think it would be fascinating if we were to look at this decade and the next decade as sort of a sequel, using your theoretical model to see how do these societies and these relationships transform over time, especially as geopolitical changes and domestic political changes begin to really take root in both societies. Another kind of question related to the discussion of civil society is a pretty simple one, and I want to be provocative here for the sake of eliciting your response, JJ, that I'm thinking, because I've been studying Korean civil society and its role in alliance politics, and one of the common themes over time, even during the hegemonic discourse era of the Cold War, you had the undercurrents that now have become more mainstream, questioning South Korean governments or South Korean elites' ability to take an independent course regarding the U.S., the charge by many Koreans over time and in recent years that the U.S.-Korea relationship is imbalanced and that South Korean government elites have been serving as certain kinds of lackeys or second-tier functionaries to the interests of the United States. And you referred to some of these as the underground discourses that never got to see the light of day. And increasingly, they are beginning to see the light of day. But if you take this argument that some Koreans have put forth, and then we throw at them your findings about the asset specificity, the identity and institutional persistence as reasons, really good reasons to explain the persistence of the alliance and the inability or unwillingness of the alliance to change fundamentally, might their response simply be, sure, you've just helped us prove how dependent Korea is on the U.S. Might they not be prone to just go and talk about simple patron-client relationship, right? In the more realist school of alliance theory and alliance politics, Might they lose the nuances of your argument? And so I would like to know what kind of a rebuttal you might throw back at them. How is the way you're looking at this different from the way that many in Korean society through the decades have criticized the alliance relationship? I have and then a curiosity that I'm very interested in. How can we account, given what you have offered in your approach and findings, how can we account for changes in asset specificity, the role of identity and identity formation, and even institutional interest? How can we account for changes in these three groupings? Do they happen independently? How does one affect the other? Because it seems that the identity aspect in Korea indeed is changing, as you note toward the end of your book. And what's really interesting to me when I read your book is that I was out in Korea doing research in the early 2000s when the FX debate was just hot, protests and everything galore. That is the first time that I know of where Korean society and even the military and political establishment were beginning to question, or not beginning, but really questioning openly, explicitly, whether a reduction of this kind of asset mutuality or what have you should be reduced. And so it's the first time that we know of, at least on a public level, that the Korean government was entertaining bids from other companies, other nations besides the United States, even if we went with the U.S. deal, even if Korea went with the U.S. deal in the long run, or in the end. But that's an interesting thing. Is it because the society's identity schemes had begun to change, or was something happening within the military or the government establishment that allowed for society to pick up on these cues? I'm not sure, but I'd be very curious. My last question is a simple one, that, when Kim Dae-jung went to North Korea in 2000, one of the featured news items was about Kim Jong-il's lack of opposition to the possibility of maintaining U.S. troops in Korea post, whatever you call it, unification, reconciliation, etc. What would make him say that? What was up his sleeve? What was going on in terms of his perceptions? What would be in his interests, or North Korea's interests, to allow for the maintenance if the geopolitical situation around Korea, and then through reconciliation, unification, the geopolitical situation on the peninsula would change? What then might account for at least this possibility that the North would agree to maintaining a certain form of an alliance or military relationship? So I'll end there.
Okay, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here at the Wilson Center alongside James Person, and especially today to be alongside two other very interesting and innovative Korea scholars, Catherine Moon and J.J. Sir. I'm going to talk about J.J.'s book. Like Catherine, I'm not going to offer a total encomium here, but I'd start out by saying I'm a historian. I'm not a political scientist. I've also looked at U.S.-South Korean relations, but I do it from a different perspective. And what I found intriguing about this book was it looks at certain issues that historians don't pay that much attention to, but it also ignores or doesn't pay that much attention to things that historians tend to emphasize. And so this introduces a lot of new and fascinating theoretical perspectives, but there's also things that I wish that I would have. There are also places that he would have been more convincing to me if he'd paid more attention to particular issues. The book, I think, clearly, as you could tell from his presentation, presents a very concise, compelling model of social scientific scholarship. It lays out a clear question or problem Why has the United States alliance with South Korea persisted after the Cold War, despite the fact that the military threat from North Korea would seem to be decreasing? And he answers the question both in his presentation and in the book very clearly, with subsequent chapters that build the case for the relevance of institutions and the relevance of identity with extremely great care and insight. He shows in the book how the alliance first helped to build a series of military and institutional relationships, which, in JJ's words, have taken on a life of their own, and by the end of the Cold War, by the 1990s, had become very difficult to dissolve or to disrupt. More interesting to me, though, was his idea of identity. He argues in the book that the alliance produced a common sense of identity between South Korea and the United States, and that the persistence of this identity has led South Koreans to continue to perceive the United States as an ally and the North Koreans as a threat, even while at the same time allowing the United States to continue to perceive South Korea as an ally. I'm going to focus my questions mostly on JJ's conception of identity and its relationship to policy. This is one of the most innovative aspects of the study. I think it works brilliantly in some places, but there are also some aspects of it that I want to question. First of all, on the question of how this pro-American identity was formed and shaped, and in this I'm also picking up somewhat on what Catherine said. One issue that I have is that I would question whether the discourse is ever, this pro-American discourse and this discourse of North Korea as a threat, is ever as stable and clearly and strongly entrenched as JJ portrays it as being. For instance, the passage that he took from Park Chung-hee, where he has Park saying, "We like America, they're our ally." I think he got that from Our Nation's Path or The Country, the Revolution, and I. But in this same book, if you look a few passages down, Park Chung-hee also writes, or actually his ghostwriters write, but Americans should also not expect to use aid as a tool for Americanizing South Korean society. So, I question whether the discourse is as stable and hegemonic as JJ makes it out to be in some places. That's one example. Also, I would say another issue, and this isn't a question only with JJ's book, but also a broader question and problem that historians often have, first with this sort of constructivist theory that he draws on, and with the postmodern Foucauldian theory that constructivism is in some ways indebted to. And that's the idea of agency. Who has agency in constructing these identities? Where do they come from? If intelligence establishments and institutions produce these discourses, how do these discursive practices come to be adopted by people and government officials? Another question I want to ask is about the relative impact of what Sir in the book calls material realities and socially constituted realities. In the book makes one of its most persuasive points, I think, on page 158, when it points to how Pakistan's nuclear program wasn't looked at as a threat to the same extent that North Korea's was, despite the material reality that Pakistan was harboring terrorists and the DPRK was not. But in some places, I wonder whether he goes too far in blaming the socially constituted realities for Americans labeling the North Koreans as a threat, and doesn't place enough emphasis on the material realities of DPRK motives and actions. For instance, In his discussion of the nuclear crisis, J.J. argues that the DPRK's nuclear program could have been interpreted either as a representation of Pyongyang's desire to negotiate or as an effort to develop a dual-purpose energy program. He also talked during his presentation about how Americans perceived some things that you would think were innocuous, peace proposals, arms reductions proposals, and how Americans continued to construct these as threats and label them as threats. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that there were other material realities, other North Korean perceptions and actions that continued to lend themselves to the construction of North Korea as a threat, such as constant reversals on allowing their facilities to be investigated, the large percentage of its gross national product that the North Korean government devoted to military spending despite the domestic social and economic problems, continuing provocations against the South, such as the infiltration of secret agents, and persistent aggressive anti-American rhetoric from the North Korean media. All of these material realities were coexisting with some of the other material realities that J.J. suggests the United States could have interpreted as being more benign. But the question is, can you really say, okay, they're putting forward arms reduction proposals, we should stop classifying North Korea as a threat when you have all of the other things going on at the same time? Finally, I guess, and this is really, I think, one of the key issues that as a historian I would have been interested in hearing more about. And that is that in the book, he doesn't give that detailed an analysis of actual decision-making and policy-making by policy-making elites. What were their actual considerations? He definitely shows the persistence of both interests and identities formed during the Cold War into the post-Cold War era. But he never really fleshes out in great detail the considerations of policymakers on either the American or the Korean side who were responsible for maintaining the alliance. He talks about specific policies and decisions, but he doesn't go into very great detail about the thinking that was behind these. And without this, it was difficult for him to fully persuade me that the decision makers responsible for shaping the alliance were motivated by identity and interests, even if it's clear that the two persisted. So those are just a few questions that I would raise. Again, I found this, nevertheless, I found this book to be fascinating and an extremely provocative and insightful read. So, thank you.
All right, thank you. JJ, would you mind if we open up the floor? I know you have a lot to address already, but for time's sake, if we could open up the floor for some questions. Again, please wait until the microphone. There was a question here. Yes. I'll ask you. I'm afraid I have to ask you to keep your questions brief.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. I'm a retired Navy officer, and I've commanded forces in NATO and had bases in various places around the world and so forth. Mine is not a theoretical one, but for your second book, let me offer the thought that as you were mentioning these things, I felt that they were things that, in my experience, would strengthen relationships, but would not serve to heal a ruptured relationship. And I wonder if you might agree with that, or at least keep it in mind. But let me ask, there's been more talk in town recently than I've heard before, that if U.S. forces were to leave Korea, that they would soon follow from Japan. Maybe more strongly stated, but these are opinions, of course. I wonder about vice versa. If U.S. forces were to leave Japan, would we find that the internal political pressures and other factors would put them at risk, and we would find that these factors existing or not, that there would be great pressure for them to leave Korea?
Thank you. Stephen, you had a question?
My name is Stephen Shore. A question on something that was noted just in passing on one of the PowerPoints. The phrase "chujuk" and most significant enemy implies that there are other enemies, presumably in the region. So I'd be curious as to whether I've picked up something correctly, and if so, in South Korean defense planning, who are these other enemies?
Okay. Take one more question before
Hi, Glenn Beck. Sorry, I haven't read your book, but let me ask: in your research, now that you looked at the alliance from various angles, do you judge the alliance to have been beneficial to the two parties concerned? In that, has the alliance, in the final analysis, has been a success? And also, in the last year or so, there's been a lot of talk in this town about a U.S.-Iraq alliance as perhaps serving as a role model for U.S. Continued presence in Iraq. Certainly, that sort of comparison, I think, is misplaced, but certainly in some circles in this town, that has been perhaps thought of as a role model. So do you see U.S.-Iraq alliance as serving as a possible role model for other U.S. relationships in different parts of the world?
Thanks. JJ, if you want to address these questions and comments, and then if we have time.
Well, thank you for the stimulating comments and the helpful comments and questions. And I guess I'll pick and choose in a random order. And as far as the Chujuk, the most significant enemy, and other enemies are concerned, I think the joint study on the vision, the joint vision, was an effort to really come up with a common understanding about the new threats, new enemies in the region and in the world. And I think this is an area where the two countries have had some difficulties. And I think one favors one particular enemy, and I guess it's a terms in contradiction. But there was some dissonance in the ways in which the two allies saw possible future threats in the region, and I think it's one possible source of a concern for the alliance if you are interested in maintaining the alliance. And another source of a concern remains to be how to perceive North Korea. And as I indicated, even Noon administration had maintained the traditional view of North Korea. But that view was somewhat softened, more softened than previous administrations. And that effect was, in a way, forced by changes in civil society. As Catherine Moon has mentioned, there has been dramatic change in the civil society of South Korea, so much so that undercurrent has become the mainstream, as Kathy said. And that change brought about changes in the ways in which Koreans perceive of North Korea. And some polls show that especially younger generation, kids in their primary schools, for example, see North Korea as just a part of the Korean nation and not as an enemy. But as you go up, the older generation still maintains the traditional view of North Korea as the enemy. And so the question is, what would happen if this demographic change continues? The old people will eventually die off, and younger ones will eventually take it over. And if they carry their perception of the North Korea as the Korean nation and not as a threat, then that has a huge implication for the alliance. Although the alliance has recognized that possibility and has been reconstituting itself as a security arrangement, not just against North Korean threat, but also against other possible threats. But I think a commonality that has been, in a way, achieved is about democracy and global terrorism. And perhaps that is a source of talks about using U.S.-ROK alliance as a model for Iraq. After 50 years of alliance, South Korea has become a model democracy, and South Korea has become the 11th largest economy of the world. And so it can be held up as a model, and Iraq may become the second Korea, or Korea of the Middle East. But it's a too simplistic comparison, as a historian would note. The domestic conditions of these two countries are just so radically different. Korea is one nation, no ethnic divides, whereas Iraq has a deep ethnic divides. And Iraq has a different history. The regional dynamics is different. Korean regional dynamics is, anything but that of the Middle East. And the time, historical time, is also very different. Korea began to develop its economy when Cold War was just kicking in, and when the U.S. was willing to provide economic assistance and act as the market, and the Vietnam War also helped the Korean economy and all that. But Iraq is now entering the world market at a radically different time. And so it's questionable whether the Korean model can be replicated in Iraq. And the success story, is held up as a model by many. But if you dig deeper, there are many complexities and complications in the story. It's not as simple as the U.S. Went into Korea and served as the alliance, and as a result, Korea developed economically and politically. And there are a lot of complexities in terms of how civil society, South Korean state, and the U.S. Have interacted with each other. And there are points when the U.S. government tried to stop a military coup by Park Chung-hee, for example. But U.S. government wasn't happy with the authoritarian Lee Seung-man. So in those instances, the U.S. was helpful with Korean democracy. But there were other times when the U.S. wasn't so helpful for Korea's democracy. For example, in 1980, when Chun Doo-hwan took over the government in a military coup, the U.S. Reagan administration wasn't necessarily supportive of those civil society forces who opposed the military. And so many tend to slide into very simplistic story, stylized story of South Korea. But if you dig deeper, the story is much more complex and multi-layered. And so it's only those who buy into stylized, the simplistic storyline who would try to apply that story to Iraq. But because of the complexity and because of the differences between the two countries, it's not going to work. Now, continuing with the discussions about civil society, I think Greg and Kathy both raise serious issues, particularly because I focus mainly on official discourses, and the official discourses that are produced and strengthened by the alliance, at the cost of not spending as much attention on alternative discourses. And of course, it's true that at any given time, there are different discourses and different views on the U.S., on South Korea, and on the world. And as Greg rightly pointed out, Park Chung-hee himself says two different things at the same time. America is a great country, but a few pages down the same book, he says, well, the U.S. should not use the aid as a tool. And even under the Park Chung-hee administration, at the height of Park Chung-hee's power, there were people who were producing different narratives about the Park Chung-hee regime, the U.S. government, and the U.S.-Korea alliance. And so at any given moment, there are different discourses at work, and there are competition. There are competitions among these different discourses. So what I try to do in this book is not to dismiss the fact that there are alternatives and that there are different discourses, but to emphasize that the alliance privileges one particular type of discourse over other alternatives. And the alliance practices strengthen one particular type of discourse that actually privilege the alliance. So there is a positive, I guess, virtuous circle going on between official discourse and alliance. And it's that virtuous cycle that I'm trying to get at in this book. And that's not to, my intention is not to dismiss the fact that there is active civil society that is promoting and producing different and even oppositional discourses. And the regional dynamics represents another dimension that does not deal with well in this book because it's mainly about Korea and the U.S. and the alliance. And I think you raise a very fascinating question. There are a lot of speculations about what would happen to U.S.-Japan alliance if U.S. forces in Korea leaves the Korean Peninsula. I think given the presence of political parties and civil society actors who have held a critical view of the U.S. Military presence in Japan, I think those political and social forces will be strengthened by their power will be strengthened if the U.S. forces leave Korea. Well, they leave Korea. Why can't they leave Japan? It's that kind of a rationale is possible, and that would strengthen their hand, and they may be able to even convince some other uncommitted public. But on the other hand, if U.S. forces leave South Korea, that could, I guess I should say, if U.S. forces should leave South Korea, then that could exacerbate security concerns that Japanese have for themselves. And there is a growing concerns about growing concerns about China and the rise of China. And of course, North Korea has become a more direct and immediate concern for the Japanese. And so if U.S. forces leave South Korea, many Japanese may even feel that their security position is even weakened. And so those will try to strengthen U.S. presence in Japan. So it's not clear, how what happens in South Korea will affect Japan, because it produces two oppositional pressures on the country. And this is related to another issue that Kathy raises, and changes in the world and the changes in the region may need time to produce their effects. People need time to sit down and digest what just hit them, and they need to think about ways to respond. And so my book might be premature, and 10 years, 20 years down the road, the kind of pressures that I didn't see in this book may come into play and produce a different outcome. But major changes began to occur early in the 1990s. End of the Cold War was a major shock to the system and to the region. And the changes of power balance on the Korean Peninsula have been rather dramatic in the 1990s. And so if you count the time from 1990, people have had 18 years to sit down, to digest, and to think about responses. And if 18 years is not enough, then I think they have a serious problem. And they have a serious problem, especially given that the alliance itself has been responding to the changes on the ground from the get-go. By 1989, the alliance tried to reduce its force presence in response to changes on the ground. So changes on the power balance on the Korean Peninsula, and changes on the global level as well as on the regional level put the pressure on the alliance, and officers and politicians began to make a change in response to that kind of transformations of the world. And in the 1990s, they also made all kinds of changes. And I think one of the most important responses is their joint study on the common vision, and those study that Rand and Kaida did on the need to maintain the alliance in the absence of the North Korean threat. And so the alliance has been very active in responding to the changes and in coming up with their responses. And I think the fact that the alliance has built up its specificities help them and empower them to come up with responses and to produce discourses that would justify their position. In contrast, civil society has been much weaker and much slower. I'm very well aware of many of the actors who were proposing different security arrangements, and who were thinking of alternative world. But in all honesty, I have to acknowledge that their response has been slow, or slower and weaker than Alliance's response. And I think what we are seeing as an outcome in the 21st century is the result of that kind of disparity in the speed and scope of their responses. And I think that this relates to both civil society and discourses. And so, again, I'm not discounting or denying what Greg and Kathy have said, but I'm just pointing out Alliance produces its own forces.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I hope, I'm sure there are many more questions, so I invite you all to a reception held right outside the door there, made possible largely through